Good morning, everybody. This is another edition of the Passball Show, brought to you by JohnPaley.com, as well as St. Aloysius Church and School in Jackson, New Jersey. Anything on your mind in the world of baseball, sports, and unified America, please let me know. You can either comment on the Facebook Live or Periscope feed, or you can give the show a call if you want, 732-364-3598. A handful of things we're going to discuss today. We're going to get into the NFL draft. Obviously a big day for a lot of sports fans. A lot of sports fans wake up this morning excited, fired up, thinking that the NFL draft is just the best thing. And obviously the thing that separates the NFL and its draft from other sports drafts, and obviously basketball is kind of looped in the same category, but the ability of the players that are drafted to impact the team right away. You expect in a first round, if you're an NFL football team, to be drafting a player that's going to be starting for you likely right away. And even when it comes down to the quarterback position, which we've always thought, hey, you get a young quarterback out of college, he sits behind a starter for a couple of years, and then becomes a starting quarterback. You're finding in more cases than not that the quarterbacks that are drafted are going right into the starting lineup with an NFL team. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. A crazy third period in one of the Game 7s in hockey. I'm going to touch on a little bit of my issue with the enforcement of penalties. We're going to talk a little bit about officiating in baseball, which we touch up on a lot. Boston University did a study. There was a bad call rate, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. But we're going to talk about something that I just don't really feel exists, and it's not just between the Mets and the Phillies. It's really the entire National League East. And you remember the year of 1993 into 1994 when the season started and there was 3 divisions, and because of that there was a lot of change in regards to what teams were going to be in different divisions. Like teams that had been rivals in the 1970s, such as the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Philadelphia Phillies, were no longer rivals. The New York Mets and the St. Louis Cardinals, who had a very bitter rivalry through the better part of the 1980s, were no longer in the same division. So when we think of the Yankees and the Red Sox, which probably is the most intense rivalry, maybe one of the most intense rivalries in all sports, but certainly the most intense rivalry that exists in baseball. There's Cubs Cardinals, who were National League East teams for a while, and then they went to the NL Central together. So that rivalry still exists. You got the Dodgers and the Giants, and you could see the difference between a bitter rivalry and a non-bitter rivalry. And sure, if you go back and you've seen, let's say, bench clearing incidents, and you look up, what involves each team, you'll see that it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a bitter, intense rival for you to go at it and throw haymakers and have a big scene on a baseball field. But I think there is a little bit of separation in that, or within that, between what a real rival is. And I think the problem that has existed in the National League East really goes back to the 90s, goes back to the 94 season when the leagues shifted and there was realignment and the Braves became the National League East team. But not only that, they became an NL East team because they ended up ruling the division for a long time. Their dominance existed in the NL East all the way through 2005. They won the division every year. And most of the years, it was a foregone conclusion that they were going to win and they weren't going to get much of a challenge. I understand in 99 and 2000, the Mets were good. So the Mets gave the Braves a little bit of a fight. Still finished second, but gave the Braves a tough fight in the 99 NLCS and then get to the World Series in 2000. But even the Mets-Braves, if you're talking about it as a Mets fan in a rivalry, is really non-existent. So we see the Mets and the Phillies kind of, I don't know. I mean, you look at something real silly as a ball getting away from a pitcher and whether that pitcher had intent. And let's be serious, it really depends on what team you're a fan of. Because any team that is a fan of a particular pitcher that happens to be pitching, or the uniform of the pitcher that's actually pitching, is going to say that that ball always got away from the pitcher. And if you're a fan of a team that's the batter, you're going to assume that 100% of the time the other team in Major League Baseball is throwing at you. And there's really no gray area. It's depending on what team you're a fan of and what side of the spectrum they're on. Were they pitching? Were they batting? If your favorite team was pitching and a ball got inside and hit a batter, there's no way that could have been on purpose. But if you were a fan of the team that was batting and the ball got inside and hit somebody or went behind somebody's head, absolutely 100%, unequivocally, that pitcher was throwing at him. So that's a fan thing, and we understand it. That exists in the game for years. But the point I want to make before I get into the rivalries, which I don't think exist in the National League, I made a couple points already, but I'll finish it off with a couple more points that will pretty much convince you that when we talk about rivals in Major League Baseball, the National League East is not full of rivalry. You can talk about New York, Philadelphia, all you want, but the problem that exists is that there really is no intense when it comes to the rivalry. But here's the thing that I got to talk about, because we've seen a change in the game for many years where pitchers put a lot more emphasis on throwing the ball, put a lot more emphasis on their ability to locate the strike zone, know where the ball's going. You look at guys like Seaver, you look at guys like Steve Carlton, the Gaylord Perrys of the world, the Don Suttons of the world. I'm talking about pitchers that were successful in the 70s and the 1980s and ended up getting in the Hall of Fame because they won 300 or more games. And they didn't do it off of the strength of their arm. They didn't do it because they threw at a ridiculous speed. They didn't do that because they scared the hitter because the hitter had no idea where the ball is going. That's part of the problem today. We don't have mechanics that are taught to pitchers at a young age. And that's a problem. And as they grow in their talent and move up through the college ranks, or in some cases go right from high school to the pros, but as they move up through what we call the minor leagues and pitching professional baseball, it's frustrating to see that these pitchers are throwing ridiculously hard but with no command. So you can make a case that any time a pitch sails by a hitter's head, that it probably wasn't controlled very well. Or, now, it's probably more negligence as opposed to intent. But once again, if you're a fan of that team that has the player that's batting and a ball sails by a player's head, you have to understand 100% of the time that it had to be on purpose because it couldn't be anywhere else. But we're talking about pitchers that are being promoted and are moving up to the minor leagues and are succeeding because they throw the ball between 95 and 100 miles an hour. They don't necessarily have command. Obviously, the ones that end up becoming stars, the ones that end up over time getting those big contracts in Major League Baseball are the ones that can command their stuff when they're throwing the ball that hard. But a lot of pitchers, and particularly middle relievers. Let's look at middle relievers for a second in baseball. We know they're very fickle, but also we know that their shelf life of staying in the major leagues is usually not that long. The guys that are coming in the fifth or sixth inning, for the most part, are getting shuttled back and forth between the major leagues and AAA over the course of the season. And that's not because they're really good, it's because they're really inconsistent. So, as we're putting all this together, hopefully the word gets out a little more that most of these pitchers that are in the game are not necessarily commanding their stuff. They can't necessarily throw the ball exactly where it is that they want to. And that's a problem. And that's a problem for a couple of reasons, but also a problem when it comes to confrontation. There's some that are more cut and dry than others. There's that, the Derek Dietrich, staring at the ball for, a minute or so after he hits a home run, and Chris Archer throwing behind him. That the intent was seen there. But then there's other times where a ball does get away from a pitcher, but once again, we are 100% set on our judgment of intent. And like I said, it's fan biased, depending on whatever team you happen to be a fan of. No, everybody's always throwing at our guys, and our pitchers, God forbid they'd ever throw one inside on purpose. So that's a fan thing. But it has to be understood that the pitchers now are not having the same type of command. They're not being promoted and moved up through the minor league system because of their command. And that is an issue and has to be judged. Some pitchers can be asked to throw at a batter and probably wouldn't be able to hit them because their command is that off. And other pitchers just have the ability that, hey, if you release a ball by just a little bit, it could go anywhere. And it has to be factored in. But the last part, when we talk about rivalries in the National League East, I think of the Phillies Pirates in the late 1970s. I think of the Mets and the Cardinals in the 1980s. Those were legitimate rivalries. What rivalries do you see in the National League East? If you go back over the course of the last 10 years and you look at the division winners in the National League East, for the most part, they've been landslides. For the most part, they've been easy wins by the teams that end up winning the division. Yes, the Washington Nationals have, 4 division titles in the last 7 years. The Braves have won a couple. The Mets won in 2015. Prior to that, it was the Phillies for, 5 straight years? And how many times over the course of those years was there an intense pennant race? There's a little bit of a pennant race here and there. Mets Nationals 2015. You could say, hey, it was a little bit wide open last year. Braves, Phillies, Mets and Nationals. And obviously the talk this year is about how strong the National League East is. And maybe there can be, over the course of time, a little bit more of a rivalry between a couple of these teams. The problem is the fans and the media want to make it out to be something that it isn't. This is not Yankees Red Sox. Phillies Mets have never had an intense rivalry really going back in the beginning of either one of their histories, from 1962 when the Mets came in the league. Sure, they've had their share of fisticuffs and on-field altercations, but that exists with a lot of different teams. Those that are trying to paint the picture that there's this intense rivalry that exists between the Mets and the Phillies, I'm sorry, it's just not there. And maybe it'll happen this year. Maybe this is the beginning of a big rivalry between the Mets and the Phillies. In order to have a rivalry, both teams need to be good. And the Mets sucked for a long time when they came into this league. 1969, the Mets were good, but the Phillies weren't any good. When the Mets were good and made it to the World Series in 1973, the Phillies weren't good. The Phillies had come off a season in 1962 where they won 59 games. The Phillies got good in the late 70s, up in the early 80s. The Mets were terrible then. You could talk about 1986 when the Mets ran away with the NL East. The Phillies, yes, they were in second place that year, but it's not like they gave them a big run for their money. The Mets getting to the playoffs again in 88, Phillies in 93, the Mets in 99 and 2000. The Mets again in 2006, and obviously the Phillies in 2007 to 2011. Both coincided with the other team not being very good. So that's one constant that's got to exist if you're talking about rivalries. The one thing that makes the Yankees-Red Sox rivalry something to really pay attention to is both teams are usually good at the same time. And I know the Red Sox are off to a bad start this year. I get it. I understand. I have no issue with that. And you want to say that they're terrible this year? Well, to this point, they have been terrible. They possess a roster that is better than the record that they've shown so far through the month of April. But Yankees-Red Sox, that's a rivalry. Phillies-Mets, you got to prove to me that there is some sort of animosity with these two clubs. Because it seems like when one of these teams are good, the other team ain't. And like I said, the constant that's got to exist is both teams got to be good at the same time if we're talking about a rivalry. This copyright and broadcast is authorized under internet rights granted by the World Wide Web and is solely for entertainment of our audience. Any publication, reproduction, or other use of the pictures, descriptions, and accounts of the show without the express written consent of the Passball Show, JohnPielli.com, and John Pielli LLC is prohibited. Any commercial or other use of the program, such as by charging admission for its showing, is similarly prohibited. So as I say this today, I think of another legendary broadcaster. And of course, a couple weeks ago, we talked about the Mount Rushmore of sports broadcasting. But it makes me think of a very good broadcaster that probably doesn't get the respect he deserved. And I certainly didn't mention him when I mentioned my top broadcasters of all time. And that is Joe Garagiola. Joe Garagiola, of course, a Missouri catcher who came up with the Cardinals system around the same time as Yogi Berra. Obviously never became Yogi Berra, but had a calm and soothing voice that we could always remember. from his days as a broadcaster. Obviously, in the days of the 70s and the 80s, he was very prolific when it came to having his voice heard, and is a guy that certainly is missed when it comes to the best broadcasters of all time. So the Major League Baseball released a list, and it was a survey done by Boston University. So they did their research, and they studied over 4 million pitches over the course of the 2018 season. And obviously there is that divide or that discussion that exists when you're talking about umpires and their control over a game. Instant replay in Major League Baseball has set it up to where managers can challenge, which is good, calls that they feel were made incorrectly. Video review, for the most part, will either back the call being what it is or change a call that was incorrectly made. The one thing that, of course, is not reviewable is balls and strikes. And Major League Baseball umpires, they are very sensitive when it comes to them being questioned when it comes to balls and strikes. And there is, when you talk about that push to make robot umpires, a lot of it has to do with the fact that umpires are very inconsistent with their strike zones. Now, we understand, going back to the days of the 80s and the 70s and before, that umpires and their strike zones were very subjective. They were different. They varied a little bit. Now they were all within the confines of around what a strike would be, but some umpires had the tendency of calling a ball up high. Some had the tendency to call pitches low, and some, had a very narrow strike zone or a wide strike zone. Now, as we're in the days of the digital and everything is being looked at, every pitch could be tracked from every fan that's watching a baseball game. And I think that's very big when it comes to the judgment of umpires of whether they're doing a good job or a bad job, because you got that box on the MLB at-bat app that if the ball is not within there and is called a strike, it is almost proof or scientific evidence that the umpire made a bad call. So out of 4 million pitches that were surveyed by Boston University, it was found that there was over 34,000 incorrect calls. And that's about 9.2% of the amount of calls that were made, the ball strike calls, over the course of the year, which is better than it's been in previous years. But when we talk about accountability in umpires in Major League Baseball, that there is no accountability. And we understand that. And these umpires are never going to have to face the media. These umpires are never going to have to answer questions on why they missed a call or why they made a call a certain way. And I understand Major League Baseball wants to protect them similarly to the way the NFL protects its officials, the NBA protects its officials, the National Hockey League protects their officials. You don't want them at a point where you got fans or unruly people or players or coaches coming after them at a game. You want to make sure that they are protected because they are doing a job. And regardless of your judgment on the job that they're doing, they are doing the best job that they can. So when you look at this survey, and Ted Barrett, who's been a guest on this show, a very good umpire, a guy who I believe does his job pretty well as we hit what we'll call about the halfway point here of the Pass Ball Show, the cuckoo clock, the whole thing, once again brought to you by JohnPielli.com and St. Aloysius Church and School in Jackson, New Jersey. So Ted Barrett, probably one of the nicer umpires, a guy that doesn't look for confrontation, probably takes a little bit more abuse than some of the other umpires, was rated as the worst umpire. 11.2% of his ball strike calls were incorrect. So you look at Joe West, the elder statesman. Obviously, all you have to do is go back to my last show and understand what I feel about Joe West. One of the more experienced umpires in baseball, he's been there for 30 years, is rated as the second worst umpire. Now, you put these two umpires together, Major League Baseball, maybe not using this data, maybe it doesn't have this data available to them. They have these umpires in the World Series. So we're talking about the meritocracy which should exist when it comes to umpires. Let's say reward the umpires that did their job the best and put them in the postseason and put them in the World Series. hopefully Angel Hernandez never gets near another playoff game because he is just quite simply a terrible umpire. But you want to make a meritocracy to exist where the umpires are judged based off of their performance and not necessarily how many years they've given into their union and their profession. Because what you're finding is the younger umpires, statistically, based off of the study done by Boston University, had done a little bit of a better job. And you'll find that the average age of umpires that, are within a certain amount of missed calls is about 36. And amongst the bad calls, it's up in the late 50s and early 60s. And you can talk about that expression, hey, you're getting too old. What do you need, glasses? We've all thrown that sentence fragment out there in some way, shape, or form at some point before, but it's almost holding true. The older umpires seem to be the ones missing the most calls. And obviously guys like Joe West, who never wants to hear it from anybody, never wants to have any accountability for the actions that he does. In fact, in some cases goes so extreme as if to obstruct and change a game just so he can throw his face out there, once again, is not a very good umpire. Just a reminder that Castrol provides maximum protection against viscosity and thermal breakdown. We'll get a little bit into the NFL draft now. And listen, you could go on NFL Network, you could go on ESPN, CBS, any of the radios or television shows. A lot of people are going to be doing previews of the draft today. I'm going to focus on a couple small things because I just don't want to be ridiculously repetitive. The one thing that has to be mentioned, and I would expect the majority of the content providers to be mentioning this today, is the Arizona Cardinals and Kyler Murray. Because over the last series of months, the expectation has been that the Arizona Cardinals are interested in taking Kyler Murray with the number 1 overall pick. Because of that, there's been speculation that their starting quarterback, Josh Rosen, will be traded. The one thing that I will say, I would expect a trade of Josh Rosen to pretty much either make a call on whether the Cardinals are definitely going to go with Murray number 1 overall, or cast some serious doubt on the fact that the Cardinals will take Murray number 1 overall. In other words, if Josh Rosen is still an Arizona Cardinal just prior to the draft, I would expect that maybe there is some doubt over whether the Cardinals are really going to take Murray. And obviously we all know that if Kyler Murray isn't taken number 1 overall by the Cardinals, it's going to set this draft into a frenzy. It's going to set the other teams that were expecting to take players all of a sudden maybe being one defensive player short. Obviously, you look at the length of the top defensive players in this draft, starting with Nick Bosa and Quinnen Williams and Josh Allen and Ed Oliver and Devin White and Montez Sweat and Rashawn Gary and Devin Bush and Christian Wilkins. These are all really good defensive players, couple linebackers, couple of defensive tackles, but mostly edge rushers that are considered to be the cream of this draft. So if the Arizona Cardinals say, listen, we want to take the best player overall, we don't necessarily want to take the quarterback, maybe they go out there and get a Bosa or a Williams that obviously is going to impact the way the teams that are picking behind them are going to react. So the team that's taking number 2 overall, the team that's taking number 3 overall, obviously you're looking at what's going to be a little bit of a change. Now, I think there's certainly enough talent, especially when it comes to these defensive players, that there's enough for everybody. So if, let's say, you want to go 1 through 8, they all want to draft defense, hypothetically, they could all get a distinctive defensive player. Now, you look at the guy, Bosa, Williams, and Allen, and I think you could say there is probably about 3 strong players. Maybe Ed Oliver's number 4 before there's a little bit of a drop-off. But if you look at the talent of guys like Devin White, Montez Sweat, and Rashawn Gary, and Devin Bush, and even Christian Wilkins, I think there is enough quality on the defensive side of the ball for just about every team to draft a legitimate defensive player. Obviously, when these guys get off the board, and we're looking at about 9 players on the defensive side of the ball before I think there's a little bit more of a drop-off. There may be a little bit of a drop-off after 3 or after 4, and I'll agree with that. But when it comes to the talent of the defensive players, it is standing out a lot more. So the need, and sometimes teams will draft for a positional need, You talk about the quarterbacks, whether it's a Murray or a Dwayne Haskins or a Drew Lock or a Jones out of North Carolina. Some teams are going to try to figure out when the best chance or best opportunity will exist that they could take that quarterback. And if Kyler Murray does go number 1 overall to the Cardinals, like I said, that would be in addition to a trade. A trade that, let's say, Allen goes to the Dolphins, Allen goes to the Giants, Allen goes to the Tennessee Titans, whatever. Whatever hypothetical trade you could talk about lands before the draft, then it'll pretty much state that the Cardinals are going to take Murray number 1 overall. Biggest concern, obviously, is what happens if they don't. What happens if they take Bosa or Quinton Williams? So the other part of this I wanted to talk about is the Washington Redskins and Daniel Snyder basically announcing that he's taken over the first round of the draft, or I don't know if he's going to take over the whole draft, whatever it turns out to be. He's the owner. He can stick his face out, whatever he wants. He can involve himself however he wants with the operation of the team that he owns. Whether you like it or don't like it, whether you're a Washington Redskins fan that likes the owner or hates the owner, or if you're a NFL fan that likes the owner or hates the owner, the bottom line is he has the autonomy to do whatever it is that he wants to do. And you always have a fear, and you think of the days of Jerry Jones, whether Jerry Jones was involved in taking players or not taking players. Al Davis was certainly very much involved in the draft and was very influential over which players that the Raiders took over their series of years. So, you want to trust, ideally, if you're an NFL franchise, the football people that you have in place in your front office to make the best football decisions. A guy like Daniel Snyder, he owns, he's an owner, he has businesses. It's a luxury for him to be able to own a pro sports team because he has the money to do it. It's not like he has the NFL background. He hasn't spent years in a front office. He doesn't understand, in some cases, some of the inner workings of the National Football League. But as the owner, he can say, hey, you guys have to take this player. So what it's leading to, probably 2 different scenarios here, or 2 similar scenarios that are all going to be based off of the same point. The Washington Redskins picking at number 15, you're getting a sense that they're probably going to take a quarterback. Obviously, they made the trade with the Denver Broncos to bring in Case Keenum. Colt McCoy is there. You know about Alex Smith probably missing this season or a significant part of the season after his rough injury that he suffered late last year. I would expect that the Redskins are going to be in the quarterback business. Now, there's a couple different ways they could go about it. They could trade up if they're interested in a guy like, let's say, hypothetically, Haskins, because I'm going to assume that Murray is going to go to the Arizona Cardinals. Now, if for some reason he doesn't, you look at the draft and the draft order and you say, what will be the next team that would be that interested? Could the Raiders take Murray at number 4 if he happens to still be there? The Buccaneers with Jameis Winston, would they be interested enough in taking Murray? The Giants, if for some reason Kyler Murray was there at number 6, I think it would be a fool to not take him. But it's interesting because Kyler Murray doesn't go number 1 overall. He could drop considerably down in the draft. But, you look at the potential of Oakland or Tampa Bay having an interest in a quarterback, but then there's the Giants who are going to need an heir apparent at some point to Eli Manning. You figure the Jaguars just signing Nick Foles will be good. The Lions with Matthew Stafford are going to be okay. The Bills got Josh Allen. Denver is interesting in number 10 because I think they would, in spite of just trading for Joe Flacco, would probably want to have somebody that is going to be in the wings and ready to go at some point. So I'd look at the Broncos at 10. I would have expected the Giants to already take Kyler Murray at 6 if he had lasted that long. But I would think that the Broncos would be a team that would be out there interested in a Haskins. And the reason that I mentioned this as it applies to the Washington Redskins is that's probably a place that they would look to move up in the draft. Now, Denver, listen, if they're set on taking a quarterback, they may not be as inclined to make a trade with them. But the Buffalo Bills may. The Detroit Lions may. The Jacksonville Jaguars may. So I think the Redskins are in a position where they're probably talking about their draft capital and what they're looking to give up to get themselves in a position to get a Dwayne Haskins. So that would pretty much be my bold prediction for the draft. I do believe Murray is going to go to Arizona, which will set up a trade of Josh Rosen to either the Giants or the Dolphins or something like that. And then my other big, bold prediction will be that Dwayne Haskins will end up with the Washington Redskins, probably via a trade. Probably via a trade with, let's say, a Jacksonville or a Detroit or a Buffalo, as long as they get a chance to pick in front of Denver, who's sitting there at number 10. But outside of this, you're talking about very good defensive players that are going to be available in this draft. T.J. Hawkinson, a tight end out of Iowa, looks like he could be a maybe a Gronkowski or a Tony Gonzalez type. And you look at D.K. Metcalf, a wide receiver. Looks like he's probably the best receiver in this draft. So there are some skilled players available, but I think it's very important to look at the draft as it always is in the NFL and how it's controlled and what it's controlled by is the fact that quarterbacks are going to be an integral part of any draft. No matter how deep a draft is, it's always going to be controlled by where the quarterbacks go. Teams are going to find in every draft an opportunity that could exist out there for them to go out there and get their franchise quarterback. Even though the pool of quarterbacks may not be so deep. That's why teams reach for quarterbacks. That's why Achilles Smith was drafted. That's why David Carr was drafted number 1 overall. And you can look at all the different draft picks, the Jamarcus Russells of the world, the Tim Couches of the world, all the different QBs that have been drafted to be franchise quarterbacks and never ended up doing that. Think of the Tennessee Titans who took, Marcus Mariota, 4 or 5 years ago. Prior to that, Vince Young looked like he was going to be pretty good. But also, they missed out on Jake Locker. So you see the amount of effort that has to exist with teams taking shots on top quarterbacks, hoping that they get the one that is going to lead their team in the future. So, obviously, you look at Murray and Haskins and Locke and Jones, and I do think there's going to be 4 distinct teams that are going to look at each one of these guys as a potential quarterback of their future. This is the famous Budweiser beer. We know of no brand produced by any other brewer that costs so much to brew and age. Our exclusive Beechwood aging produces the taste, the smoothness, and drinkability you will find in no beer at any cost. So last thing I wanted to touch on, and I waited to the end to bring this up because obviously something happened on Sunday. So my concern that exists with the National Hockey League is the enforcement of a 5-minute major at any point. Now, safety has got to go first with the NHL. Now, if there's a major boarding call or a no doubt, let's say, high stick or swinging a stick that it results in a match penalty type of thing, then this is not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about a marginal call that could be from a minor to a double minor to a major that is just basically the judgment of the officials. And just because a little blood was drawn, we're going to go the most dramatic route and assess a 5-minute major in a major playoff game, in a Game 7, which was exactly what happened between the Las Vegas Golden Knights and the San Jose Sharks. And it ended up costing the Las Vegas Golden Knights a chance to win that series and move on. And it's unfortunate. And obviously, when it comes down to it, it's up to the Vegas Golden Knights when they're playing on defense for 5 minutes to be able to stop the opposition. They gave up 4 goals in 5 minutes, and for those hockey fans or those fans that don't know what a 5-minute major is in hockey, we know that a power play, whether it's 2 minutes or 4 minutes, most of the cases it's 2 minutes, once a team scores during that power play, when a team is short one player, the teams go back to full strength. In a major penalty, that player sits out or sits in a penalty box for the duration of the 5 minutes, regardless of how many goals are scored. And I remember the Stanley Cup Finals between the New Jersey Devils and the Los Angeles Kings. The Kings had gone up 3-0 in the series. The Devils had won the next 2 games to make it 3-2. Game 6 really turned on a 5-minute major penalty. Steve Bernier was, assessed a 5-minute major. The Kings scored a couple goals and kind of never looked back, ended up winning themselves a Stanley Cup. In this situation, you're talking about a Las Vegas Golden Knights team that's up 3-0, and the penalty that is assessed as a major is a little questionable. It's not a no-doubter. So because of that, Vegas is shorthanded. San Jose. The San Jose Sharks end up scoring 4 goals, take a 4-3 lead. The Golden Knights tie it up before San Jose ends up winning in overtime. And in this case, one call or one judgment by the official was the difference in determining who ended up winning Game 7. It's unfortunate. And I do think you have to be careful if you're the officials when you are assessing a penalty that has a chance to maybe determine a game. And I think it should be assessed a little bit harder in the playoffs. I think in some cases, and you find in the NFL, there's different things that you get away with. The NBA, I think you can get away with a little touching and grabbing in the playoffs that you don't get away with in the regular season. And I'm not an advocate on changing the rules completely, but you got to make sure that as the officials, if you're talking about a play that could determine a series, was it that egregious? Was this player really that in the wrong in what they did? Now, a penalty should have been called, absolutely. But like I said, you want to assess a double minor in that situation, I think it might have been a better call to make. And obviously, the onus is on the Vegas Golden Knights to stop San Jose from scoring 4 goals in 5 minutes. So I'm not going to exonerate Vegas and say, hey, they got screwed. At the same time, they still had to play hockey for those 5 minutes. And they gave up 4 goals. The 2 goals were within about 30 seconds of each other, and you could tell this penalty really did impact them in the way that they played. And that swing of 5 minutes was the determining factor in what team ended up moving on in the next round in the NHL. A little bit of a recap of the show today. I do want to thank everybody, as always, for tuning in. We spoke a little bit about umpires, and Boston University did a study and basically did some research as far as how many calls were missed out of the 4 million or so pitches in 2018 season. You're talking about 34,000. And a couple interesting things that were brought up there that I mentioned before. It showed that umpires in baseball have the tendency to call strike 3 when there's a 2-strike count. In other words, they are more inclined to call a ball a strike when there's 2 strikes than when the count is not 2 strikes. So I do think umpires got to be conscious of this, and I understand they're in a flow of the game, probably want to make the game move a little bit, and if a pitcher goes out there and throws strike 1 and strike 2, the umpire is more inclined to be a little more lenient with strike 3. Obviously, we're talking about a digital age now. We're talking about the fact that everything is tracked. You can look, like I said, on the MLB at-bat app and find how close a pitch was or wasn't and whether it was called a ball or strike. The umpire's got to be conscious of this, and hopefully the research and data that's been gathered is used in a way to help the umpires, to help them be more conscious of their shortfalls and try to make the most amount of calls correct when they're talking about balls and strikes as possible. We understand it's subjective. We understand that nobody's going to be perfect. I heard Angel Hernandez in one of his back and forths with one of the umpires or players talk about the fact that the home plate umpires get 4 bad calls a game. And I think that's fair enough. You could be off a little bit and say, hey, my subjective strike zone says that that's a strike. But you also don't want to vary too much for it. You don't want to call a pitch that's just off the plate a strike and then give the pitcher another 2 inches on a pitch that's further off the plate. So hopefully the umpires are taking all this data and are using it in a constructive manner and trying to better the game, not just for the players and the fans, but for themselves as people that are officiating the game. We talked about the NFL draft. Like I said, Kyler Murray doesn't go number 1 overall. It could set the draft up in a weird spot. Daniel Snyder and the Washington Redskins, the owner involving himself in the selection of the first round draft pick, is probably leaning the Redskins towards getting a quarterback. I wouldn't be shocked if they ended up with Dwayne Haskins. And at least there's no rivalry that exists in this division. So let's stop talking things up if you're a Mets fan or a Phillies fan or a Nationals fan or a Braves fan. Where is the rivalry that exists in the National League East? Because when I think of rivals in the NL East, I think of Phillies Pirates, late 70s. I think of Mets Cardinals in the 80s. Outside of a little bit of Mets Braves maybe in the late 90s. Outside of that, where's the rivalry in the NL East? 5-minute majors in the playoffs, I don't think they should be enforced unless it's an egregious a play, unless it's absolutely a no-doubter. Ends up costing the Vegas Golden Knights, but once again, the onus is on them. They're playing 5 minutes shorthanded. You can't go out there and give up 4 goals. This is the Passball Show, brought to you by JohnPielli.com, as well as St. Aloysius Church and School in Jackson, New Jersey. God bless you. Have a nice weekend. And as always, I'll see you on the other side.